All right, so today we'll be covering Hurley Chapter 1, Section 6 on extended arguments. And the skill that we're going to be learning today is how to diagram arguments. Diagramming arguments is useful because it is another tool we have for showing how an argument arrives at its conclusion, the logical structure of an argument. So let's look at some of the basics first. So to diagram arguments, we number the statements, or when we're doing exercises in the text, the statements are actually numbered for us. And we use arrows to illustrate the inferential link between statements. The premises, or the numbers representing the premises, are placed in circles above the number representing the conclusion, and arrows from the premises are drawn to the conclusion, showing that supporting relationship. So let's take a look at an example. The contamination of underground aquifers represents a pollution problem of catastrophic proportions. Half the nation's drinking water, which comes from these aquifers, is being poisoned by chemical waste dumped into the soil for generations. So the first thing we need to do when diagramming arguments is we need to differentiate the parts of the argument. So we look for the conclusion and look for the premises, in this case, premise. So as we talked about in the very first lecture, when there are no indicator words, there are no indicator words here, we should strongly suspect that the first statement is going to be the conclusion. So if that's the case, then the conclusion to this would be that the contamination of the underground water is a big problem, right? And why is that the case? Well, that would be the case because half the nation's drinking water comes from those underground aquifers. So that would show that this is going to be a real big problem, right? So statement 2 gives us reason to believe statement 1. So the way that we would diagram that we put the ultimate conclusion at the bottom there, so that's just number 1. And then the premise above it, so number 2, with an arrow pointing down to it, showing that 2 leads us to believe 1. So that's going to be the basic pattern, but there's some more complicated tools that we'll need because we'll see some more complicated arguments in this chapter. But in general, we'll be putting the conclusion at the very bottom and then showing how the premises, and if there are any sub-arguments, how those sub-arguments and premises lead down to the conclusion. So let's take a look at one kind of pattern of support that we might see. This pattern is called the vertical pattern. So the vertical pattern consists of a series of arguments in which a conclusion of one argument becomes a premise for a further argument. Take the following argument, for example. The development of carbon-embedded plastics, otherwise called composites, is an important new technology because it holds the key for new aircraft and spacecraft designs. This is so because these composites are not only stronger than steel, but lighter than aluminum. So again, what we need to do is determine the ultimate conclusion, and we can use indicator words to try to help us along the way. We see some indicator words here. We see because, and this is so because. So the word because is a premise indicator, and then this is so because, that will be another premise indicator. So the only statement that isn't preceded by a premise indicator is that first statement, right? So the development of carbon-embedded plastics is an important new technology. And then the passage is going to give us reasons why it's an important new technology. So here the conclusion is 1. We put that at the bottom of our diagram. And then why does the passage say we should believe that the development of composites is an important new technology? Well, we should believe that because, two, it holds the key for new aircraft and spacecraft designs. So we show 2 supporting 1, just like in the previous example. But now let's look at how statement 3 relates to all this. Right before statement 3, it says, this is so. So the this that it's referring to is statement 2, right? So why does the development of carbon plastics hold the key to new aircraft and spacecraft designs? Because these composites are not only stronger than steel, but lighter than aluminum. So 3 here supports 2, and then 2 supports 1. So the way we would indicate that is like this. We have 3 leading down to 2. So 3 is the premise. So composites are not only stronger than steel, but lighter than aluminum. Therefore, they hold the key for new aircraft and spacecraft designs. And since they hold the keys for new aircraft and spacecraft designs, we go all the way down to 1. It's an important new technology. So this again is the vertical pattern. So you see a conclusion of one argument. So 2 is the conclusion of one argument, becoming a premise for a further argument. All right, another pattern we'll see is called the horizontal pattern. So the horizontal pattern consists of a single argument in which 2 or more premises provide support for a single conclusion. And they relate to the conclusion such that if one premise was taken away, the others would continue to support the conclusion. So let's take a look at an example, and I'll talk about this a little bit more. So the example paragraph, it appears that animals may be able to predict earthquakes. Prior to a major quake in China, hundreds of snakes suddenly appeared from hibernation and froze to death in the snow. Fish were seen leaping from rivers and lakes, and cows and horses refused to enter barns. Also, prior to a quake in Fremont, California, a flood of callers reported strange behavior from their pets and domestic animals. All right, so again, what we want to do here is we want to identify the conclusion. We don't see any premise or conclusion indicator words, so again, we should strongly suspect that that first statement is going to be the conclusion. The first statement, it appears that animals may be able to predict earthquakes. The rest of the passage shows some examples of that. So it makes sense that the most general claim here that animals may be able to predict earthquakes, that's going to be our conclusion. So we'll put that at the bottom of our diagram. And then what reason do we have to believe that animals may be able to predict earthquakes? Well, one reason is, number 2, prior to a major quake in China, hundreds of snakes suddenly appeared from hibernation and froze to death in the snow, which, besides being terrifying, is also a reason to believe our conclusion here. And then we're offered another reason to believe the conclusion. Fish were seen leaping from rivers and lakes before that earthquake. So another reason to believe that conclusion. Cows and horses refused to enter barns. More support for the conclusion. And prior to a quake in Fremont, California, a flood of callers reported strange behavior from their pets and domestic animals. Another reason to believe the conclusion. Now, this is called the horizontal pattern for obvious reasons. You see those premises 2, 3, 4, and 5, they're all on the same horizontal line, and they all support the premise, and they all give independent support. Sorry, they all support the conclusion, and they all give independent support for the conclusion, such that if we took any of them away, the conclusion would still remain supported by the rest of them, right? So if we took away that number 5 about the Fremont quake, we would still have 2, 3, and 4 about the major quake in China, how animals acted before the major quake in China, that would support our conclusion that it appears animals may be able to predict earthquakes. All right, so that's the horizontal pattern. Now, another pattern we will run into is called conjoined premises. So, two premises support the conclusion conjointly when the premises depend on one another in such a way that if you took one away, the support the others provide would be either destroyed completely or diminished at least. So, conjoined premises will be similar to the horizontal pattern, but recall with the horizontal pattern, the premises supported the conclusion independently. In the conjoined pattern, they only support the conclusion together, or at least they support it more together. So let's look at an example here. Numerous cancer patients on chemotherapy suffer from constant nausea, loss of appetite, and ability to sleep. For many of these patients, inhaled marijuana is the only medicine that provides relief. For these reasons, medical marijuana should be legalized and made available to these patients. All right, so again, we want to first identify the conclusion. We see an indicator word, series of indicator words here. So we have for these reasons. So that tells us that what came before were the reasons, and the conclusion will be medical marijuana should be legalized and made available to those patients. So we'll put that at the bottom of our diagram. 3 goes down here. And now we have a couple of premises. 1, numerous cancer patients on chemotherapy suffer from constant nausea, loss of appetite, and ability to sleep. And the other premise, for many of these patients, so who are these patients? The cancer patients on chemotherapy, inhaled marijuana is the only medicine that provides relief. So we're wondering, what way do 1 and 2 support the conclusion? Well, if we took either one of them away, independently, those premises would not provide any support at all for the conclusion. So take 1, for example. Numerous cancer patients on chemotherapy suffer from nausea, loss of appetite, and ability. If we jumped right from there to the conclusion, for these reasons, medical marijuana should be legalized and made available to these patients, number 1 wouldn't really be support for the conclusion because we don't have anything in the argument that tells us that marijuana relieves some of those symptoms, right? Similarly, for 2, if we just had, for many of these patients, inhaled marijuana is the only medicine that provides relief, and then in the conclusion, we get these patients again, but if we just had premise 2 and the conclusion 3 without 1, we wouldn't know who these patients are. Premise 1 fills in that information. It tells us numerous cancer patients, right, on chemotherapy. So 1 and 2 work together to support 3. They're conjoined. So the way we indicate that in our diagram, we put those premises on the same level. And we conjoin them with a bracket or brace, and then have an arrow leading from that all the way down to 3. So this shows us that 1 and 2 together support 3. Brace. That's going to be a brace. All right. So now let's look at the final piece that we're given, the final pattern that we're given for arguments. So the final pattern is called multiple conclusions. So recall 1.1 in the text told us that no argument has multiple conclusions. Every argument has just one conclusion. And the text still goes with that. But for ease of presentation, when we're trying to diagram complex arguments, we're going to treat cases in which the same premises of 2 arguments leading to multiple conclusions as 1 argument leading to multiple conclusions. So if you have the same premises leading to different conclusions, that's technically 2 arguments, 2 distinct arguments, but we're going to diagram them as if they go together because they share the same premises. So take the following argument, for example. The reckless riding practices of BMX bikers are a hazard to citizens of this county. Consequently, there should be stricter laws limiting the places they can ride, and they should try to be more aware of their surroundings. So again, the first thing we want to do is identify the conclusion. We see a conclusion indicator word here, consequently. And we see the conclusion, it looks like the conclusion has two parts, right? There should be stricter laws limiting the places that BMX bikers can ride, and they should try to be more aware of their surroundings. So the way, and both of those conclusions are arrived at from one premise. So one premise leads to two, that same premise leads to three. Technically, those are two separate arguments, but the way we diagram them for ease of presentation is like this. So this shows us that premise one leads to two conclusions, 2 and 3. So the reckless riding practices of BMX bikers are hazardous to citizens of this county. That leads us to believe, or led this person to believe, that there should be stricter laws limiting the places they can ride, and they should try to be more aware of their surroundings. So that's how we'll do multiple conclusions. Now, in this section, we're going to run into complex arguments that will require multiple of these strategies to diagram. And out in the world, you'll be creating your own arguments that use a number of these patterns, and you'll run into arguments that use a number of these patterns. So let's look at a more complex example and see how we can diagram the argument with these tools. So this argument says, although Thomas Jefferson's contributions to the foundation of the country are profound, as the master of Monticello, Jefferson was a monster. Simultaneously with his writing the Declaration of Independence, which announced the self-evident truth that all men are created equal, he owned 175 slaves. Clearly, the man was a creepy hypocrite. But Jefferson was also cruel. He sometimes punished slaves by selling them away from their family and friends. And for slaves and free blacks who ran afoul of the law, he advocated harsh, almost barbaric forms of punishment. All right, again, the first thing we want to do is identify the conclusion. And I've said before, strongly suspect the first statement. But in this case, the first statement is about Thomas Jefferson's contributions to the foundation of the country. And none of the rest of the passage is about that. In fact, the entire rest of the passage is all about two. As the master of Monticello, Jefferson was a monster. And then it gives reasons why we might think he was a monster. So in this passage, we should leave one out of it. One sort of sets up this issue, gives us a contrast for the actual conclusion that as the master of Monticello, Jefferson was a monster. So 2 is the conclusion. We're going to leave 1 out of our diagram. So we'll put 2 down here at the bottom. Now, why should we believe he was a monster? Let's see what 3 tells us. So 3 tells us, simultaneously with his writing the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of Independence announced the self-evident truth that all men are created equal. He also owned 175 slaves. So he wrote a document saying people shouldn't own slaves, or at least strongly implying that people shouldn't own slaves, but at the same time, he did own slaves. So he said one thing, he did another. That would be reason to believe that he's a hypocrite. And that's what 4 says. So we have 3 leading to 4. So he's a creepy hypocrite. Why should we believe that? He said people shouldn't own slaves, but own slaves. So, and that all gives us reason to believe that he was a monster. So why should we believe he's a monster? We should believe he's a monster because he was a creepy hypocrite. Why should we believe he was a creepy hypocrite? He said one thing and did another, and that is in number 3. All right, now let's look at 5, 6, and 7. 5 says Jefferson was also cruel, but the passage as of yet hasn't given us any reason to believe that he was cruel. So why should we think that he was cruel? Well, he sometimes punished slaves by selling them away from their family and friends. That seems cruel. And for slaves and free blacks who ran afoul of the law, he advocated harsh, almost barbaric forms of punishment. So both reasons to think that he was cruel. So the way this seems to go is we have a couple reasons in this passage for thinking he's a monster. He was a creepy hypocrite, and also he was cruel. And what reasons do we have for believing he was cruel? We have 6, he sometimes punished slaves by selling them away from their family and friends. That would be reason by itself to believe that he was cruel. And for slaves and free blacks who ran afoul of the law, he advocated harsh, almost barbaric forms of punishment. Another reason to believe that he's cruel. So for this argument, we see that it follows a couple different patterns. It's vertical in that 3 leads to 4, leads to 2. And on the other hand, 6 and 7 lead to 5, lead to 2. But it also has a horizontal dimension, right? So 4 and 5 lead to 2, and 6 and 7 lead to 5. So now we see the way the whole argument works. One of the reasons this can be handy is it can show us where the weak points of the argument are, and where we might attack it, were we to attack it. So we can see which premises are supported by a number of premises and which remain unsupported. So here at the top level, at the very top level, you'll see premises that are unsupported, right? And if those aren't easily verifiable facts, then that would be a good place to attack an argument. All right, let's look at one more argument here before we get to our quiz questions. So society values white lives more than black lives. This is clear from the fact that killers of whites are much more likely to be sentenced to death than killers of blacks. Of the 1,788 people currently on death row, 1,713 were convicted of killing a white person. It's a huge percentage. Yet, blacks are 6 times more likely to be murder victims than whites are. In Florida, no one has ever been executed for murdering a black person, but dozens have been executed for murdering white people. Okay, so again, we want to identify the conclusion, and we should strongly suspect the first statement. The first statement is the broadest statement. Society values white lives more than black lives. That's, controversial claim. We need to hear an argument for it, and the rest of the passage does provide an argument for it. We also see an indicator word, right? This is clear from the fact that. So that tells us that 1 is going to be supported by 2. So why should we believe that society values white lives more than black lives? Because killers of whites are much more likely to be sentenced to death than killers of blacks. So let's indicate that relationship here. So we have 2 as a premise for number 1. Now, why should we believe that killers of whites are much more likely to be sentenced to death than killers of blacks? 3 and 4 seem to give us some reason, right? So 1,788 people are on death row. 1,713 were convicted of killing a white person. That by itself would give us some evidence for number 2. But combine that with number 4, that blacks are 6 times more likely to be murder victims than whites are. You put those 2 facts together, you wouldn't think they would go together, but they do, to indicate that killers of whites are much more likely to be sentenced to death than killers of blacks. Black people are much more likely to be murdered, but if you're on death row, then you most probably, almost definitely murdered a white person, right? So those together, 3 and 4, give us reason to believe 2. So those are conjoined. If you take away either one, the support for the other is diminished or there isn't any at all. For example, if you took away 3 and just had premise 4 leading to 2, it would say blacks are 6 times more likely to be murder victims than whites are. But that wouldn't tell us anything to support the number 2, that killers of whites are much more likely to be sentenced to death than killers of blacks. So together, those give a lot of support to number 2. All right, so now let's see what's happening in Florida. In Florida, no one has ever been executed for murdering a black person, but dozens have been executed for murdering white people. Again, if you put these facts together, they give much more support to what they're trying to support, which is 2, killers of whites are much more likely to be sentenced to death than killers of blacks. So in Florida, no one has been executed for murdering a black person, and dozens have been executed for murdering white people. Let's put those together. 5 and 6. And together, those will show that the killers of whites are much more likely to be sentenced to death than killers of blacks. So here we see a vertical dimension to this argument, and we also see a couple of sets of premises that are conjoined. All right, so what we learned today is how to diagram arguments, a few different patterns, a vertical pattern, a horizontal pattern, conjoined premises, and multiple conclusions. Using those patterns, you should be able to diagram just about any argument. So now let's take a look at the quiz questions. So quiz question number 1, which pattern of the 4 that we talked about does the following argument follow? And it will only follow one of those 4 patterns. So the selling of human organs, such as hearts, kidneys, and corneas, should be outlawed. If this practice is allowed to get a foothold, people in desperate financial straits will start selling their organs to pay for their bills. Alternately, those with a criminal bent will take to killing healthy young people and selling their organs on the black market. So which pattern does that follow? Is it a vertical pattern, horizontal, conjoined premises, or multiple conclusions? And quiz question number 2, which pattern does the following argument follow? The selling of human organs, such as hearts, kidneys, and corneas, should be outlawed. Allowing human organs to be sold will inevitably lead to a situation in which only the rich will be able to afford organs. This is so because whenever something scarce is bought and sold as a commodity, the price will always go up. So note we have the same conclusion from quiz question number 1, but a different argument leading to it. So which pattern does this argument follow? And finally, quiz question number 3. Which pattern does the following argument follow? Getting poor people off the welfare rolls requires that we modify their behavior patterns. The vast majority of people on welfare are high school dropouts, single parents, or people who abuse alcohol and drugs. These behavior patterns frustrate any desire poor people may have to get a job and improve their condition in life. So how do the premises of this argument support the conclusion? All right, so that's the video today and the end of chapter 1. I'll see you next time.